What's going on, guys? So this video is going to be basically just my desk, 3 optics, and my hands the entire time. Really quickly, I just wanted to say what's up and introduce myself if this is the first video you're watching of mine. My name's Tyler. I'm nobody special. I just care about guns and building guns and gear and preparedness and all that kind of good stuff. So if you're into that sort of thing, if you like what I'm doing with the channel, with this video, feel free to rate, maybe subscribe, drop me a comment down below if you have ideas for future videos. And that's basically it. No long intro. Alright, so after about a full year, maybe longer than that, I finally got my hands on a Holosun 508T X2. Really quickly, to get this out of the way, I want to make sure you guys understand I'm going to use the terms X2 and V2 interchangeably throughout this video. The only difference between a 508T X2 and a V2 is that the V2 is the one that they released first. Initially, the buttons didn't look like this. They had vertically oriented buttons, so plus and minus. They were a little bit larger and they were a little bit stiffer, very much like the Trijicon RMR buttons. Holosun got sued by Trijicon. They settled and they had to redesign these buttons, so they made them smaller, a little bit more rubbery, and they're now horizontal. I think that's really dumb, but you know, in business, you gotta do what you gotta do. So the X2 is this revised version with these smaller buttons. That's the only difference as far as I can tell, as far as I know. We'll get into this package really quickly. We're not gonna do a full unboxing. You've got your nice little cover, a little bit of foam, user manual. They give you a cleaning cloth, and then you're gonna have desiccant. You have this little mount. This is kind of cool. They're not going to do these anymore, so all their newer generation optics that they're continuing to produce right now won't have these mounts, but these pick mounts are cool if ever you wanted to run that on like a rifle or something. You have that option, but these are not going to be included in future optics. You have your screws of various sizes, and the last thing that would have been in this slot here is this new tool. So on one side you have your Torx bit, which is going to be used for the screws. And then on this side, you have like a real small flathead, which you're going to use to adjust for windage and elevation. And then also, you're going to use that to remove the screw for your side-loading battery tray. There's also these little pockets there that you can shove that into and get some leverage if you ever have trouble getting the battery tray out. Really brief overview of the features of this optic. It's honestly very similar to the original 508, which I have a video about, so I'm not going to go too deep into that. But real quick, you have a option for 3 different sight pictures. You have a dot, you have a circle reticle around that dot, so you can run it with just the dot, you can run it with just the circle, or you can do both, whereas something like an RMR only has, you know, your dot. So you have 3 different reticle options. You have your brightness adjustments here. You also have options for auto adjust on the brightness. You have options for manual lockout, so you can make sure that once you set your brightness, it's kind of just locked there wherever it is. There are a couple of night vision settings if you run stuff like that. If you're very wealthy and you have nods. You have your adjustments, windage, elevation, and so on. And the big one here is the side-loading battery tray. This is nice because once the optic's on the gun and it's mounted up, you'll never have to re-zero it as long as you don't remove it. So you can leave the optic on there. Anytime you have to swap your battery out, you pull the tray out, pop a new one in, and you're good to go. Holosun's claim to fame has also been the inclusion of this solar panel on top. So this is not like going to charge your battery, but it is a battery backup. So if you were, let's say, outside, you know, or you had enough ambient light to actually power the optic, it will switch over to that solar backup. Or if the optic was fully dead, you didn't have the battery in there at all, you could just run this, or the battery was dead, sorry, you could just run this off of solar power if there were enough ambient light. The big difference between this second generation and their first generation was mainly the design of the hood, or the frame, if you want to call it that. Obviously, this is round on top, this is square on top. That square shape is supposed to withstand impact better. If you want to see exactly how true or untrue that is, you can check out Aaron Cowan's video on the subject. He does a bunch of crazy testing on these optics, and so far, all 3 of these options actually have passed his drop test. So any of them seem like good choices. But in theory, at least, it would seem that this flat top with hard corners might be a little bit more sturdy than that round top. Just like the previous generation, these are both made out of titanium. The body being out of titanium, a lot of people have this misconception that titanium is lighter than aluminum. That is not actually true. Titanium is stronger and more resilient, so it can be made thinner and smaller. So if you took, this design and you made it out of titanium, you made it thinner and smaller all the way around, it could be lighter in that case. But Holosun's whole thing is that if they use titanium, they're doing it to make the optic stronger. So even if you had this optic made out of aluminum, the aluminum would be lighter. It's just that the titanium is supposed to be stronger. Now, a quick comparison to the venerable RMR. This is an RMO9. That is the 1 MOA dot. And Trijicon has a variety of different options as far as your dot size. You have the 1 MOA, a 3.25, and a 6. And they also have the dual illuminated with the fiber optic kind of backup. Never been a fan of those. I prefer the LED version, and this has been kind of tried and true. This has been the industry standard for the longest time. The thing is, though, when you really start looking at this, the RMR, it's a little outdated, if I had to say. It has a bottom-loading battery, which, same thing with the Gen 1 of this one, but it's not sealed, so you usually have to run a plate to make sure that you don't get water into that space. Every time you have to swap that battery, that means the optic does need to come off. You do need to re-zero it. The glass is not quite parallax free. You can see maybe that lens shift at the edges. Also, it is very, very much tinted. These are as well. So Holosun optics are also tinted. I don't know if this is going to show up on camera, but it's not quite as blue-green as the RMR, for whatever that's worth. The other thing, the big thing for the RMR is that because this is made in America, whereas Holosuns are made in China, Trijicon stuff just costs a lot of money. Like when I bought this before all the craziness in the past year, I think I got this for like $480-ish before tax. Whereas a Holosun optic like this, brand new, I don't even think you can make the argument that this doesn't have more features. But brand new, this cost me $370. By the way, I know people are selling it for more than that because these are hard to get right now, but if you're paying more than $370, I kind of feel like you're getting ripped off. For the sake of comparison, though, this is $100 less than the RMR was. So, value for money, I think Holosun wins by quite a big margin. But as far as reputation goes and service record goes, I think the RMR takes that. At some point, though, if people are running these long enough and hard enough, you kind of have to get over that and think to yourself, like, do you want more features for less money, or do you want to pay more money for less features just because this is made in America? And the answer might be yes, and that's totally fine. That's up to you. One thing I wanted to get into that I've not seen elsewhere online, and trust me, I looked when I was trying to shop around for optics, is the actual dimensions. Now, if you want to skip this part of the video, that's fine. I'm actually going to put these measurements up on the screen here. And I'm also going to link down below in the description to a spreadsheet I made both in standard and metric units for those of you guys outside the US if you want to see the actual dimensions of all of these things. But really quickly, we're going to define dimensions. So we have length being the distance from the back of the optic, which is completely flat, to the farthest part of the front of the optic, which is slightly convex. So it slightly protrudes out in the middle there. So that length, in order, we have Trijicon RMR 1.782, and these two are both about 1.77. So that's 10 thousandths of an inch. Doesn't sound like much, and truthfully it's not. Barely anybody's going to notice that. You're not going to be able to see it visually. The only reason I mention this, the only reason it matters, is because everybody says these share the same footprint, and that's kind of true, but it's kind of not. If you mill a gun or a slide for an RMR, which has the slightly longer dimension there, these two would fit. But if you mill the slide specifically for the dimensions of a Holosun, an RMR probably will not fit. I believe most companies who are doing this professionally probably just mill the pocket for the RMR dimension, and they let the Holosuns have a little bit of gap there. It's not going to affect the stability of your optic if you're worried about that, but something worth mentioning in case you're taking your gun to kind of a small local shop and you hand your machinist your slide with a Holosun, don't think or don't assume that milling your gun for a Holosun means it'll fit an RMR. But if you do it the other way around, you mill for an RMR, probably will take either Holosun. Now, going on to the width, this is a little bit trickier. The width is going to be obviously the width, right? You have your distance from the left side to the right side of the body. For this first measurement, I'm actually going to ignore protrusions such as on the V2, how we have this side-loading battery tray that does actually stick out a little bit, or on the RMR, we're not going to include the actual buttons, which, surprise, surprise, they do stick out a little bit as well. In order though, the RMR is actually the slimmest at 1.101 width. The version 1 is 1.157, and then the version 2, 1.143. So these two, again, effectively, the actual bodies of the optics are roughly the same size. The RMR is marginally slimmer. If you're gonna put this on like a Glock, let's say, or like on my P10, the RMR is almost the same width. There's barely any overhang. It's one of those things where unless you were really looking at it close, you probably wouldn't notice. Whereas mounting one of these guys onto a similar size slide, you can tell there's gonna be some overhang. If that bothers you, maybe don't get one of these. As for the total width now, including any protrusions, Holosun's 508T version 1, there are none. So it's the same measurement, right? There's no button sticking out, there's no side-loading battery tray. Going on to the RMR, if we include the width of the buttons, we're actually looking at 1.201. So, you know, 1/10 of an inch extra. That's not that much, it's not a huge deal, but it's there. And then we have your 508T V2, which is coming in at 1.210. So a tiny, tiny bit more than RMR if we include that side-loading battery tray. It's important to note because when I was shopping around for this, I was worried this was going to stick out a little bit more than it did. But if you think about that, that's essentially as wide as the RMR with buttons. So this side-loading battery tray, you would never notice it. It doesn't really make your gun much wider. It doesn't print any more than it would already. Height, in this case, is going to be the measurement from the bottom of the optic to the highest points on the top. So it's not like we're going to be measuring from here to this dip. We're going to be measuring from here to the top of this corner, right? So in the case of the RMR, it's almost exactly an inch. It's 1 inch and 2 thousandths. Going on to the version 1, this is obviously the tallest because it has that kind of convex top at 1.15. And then finally, going on to the V2, that distance is going to be 1.089. So not a huge difference there in height, but something that is worth mentioning is that when you have something like an RMR or this V2 with hard edges or hard corners at the top of your hood, that does print. It definitely prints more than something like this that is rounded. The distance from the bottom here to the start of this radius is actually significantly lower than the bottom here to the top of this corner. So underneath your shirt, I actually think that despite this being taller, in absolute terms, it actually hides a little bit better than both of these two. They're close, the RMR and the version 1, they're pretty close, but this one is probably the hardest to conceal because it's not only a little bit taller than the RMR, but it also has the same sharp corner. The last thing here is the glass. The glass dimensions, we're just going to be measuring the width, which is going to be left side to right side. In the case of the RMR, we're looking at 0.924. In the case of the version 1, that width is going to be 0.935, and the V2, 0.923. Those are all similar enough that they don't actually matter. The width of it really makes no difference because when you are tracking that down on the recoil, it shouldn't be moving sideways. It should be moving up and down, if anything. Which brings us to the next and last measurement. That is going to be the height of your window. So the RMR window, from bottom to the top, the highest point of the top of that window, you're looking at 0.675. For your version 1, we're looking at 0.674. And then for your version 2, we're looking at 0.600, so 6 flat. Now, that's kind of a funny thing because technically the RMR has, I mean, this the biggest, but you know, by 1,000th, but it has roughly the same size window as this. But when you have this on a gun, it doesn't look like that. The reason that is the case is because the window and the whole optic is a little bit shorter, so the window actually sits down a little bit lower. So assuming you're not changing your sights, your backup irons, or I don't know if you're running irons, assuming you're not changing those sights, your sights will obscure this window a little bit more than this window, because this window, this glass, you notice, sits up a little bit higher. You see how big that edge is? Same thing is true here, right? So I'd honestly say the smallest effective window, despite this being the largest absolute size, the smallest effective window is the RMR. Followed closely by the V2 or X2, slightly larger effective window size. And the largest effective window size is a 508, which, by the way, 508 version 1 with this kind of rounded top, it's going to have the same window size as like a 507 nowadays. If we compare the three, you have the RMR, which comes in at the highest price point, longest service record. Everybody would agree this is more or less bomb-proof, at least the V2s. Despite it being expensive, it is very reliable. You have your variety of dot sizes. You have your very, very sturdy adjustment buttons. Downsides to this obviously are the price, and then also the fact that you have to re-zero this every time you need to change the battery. And then going on to the 508, which again, there's another video about this on the channel if you want to look at that. This is, you know, I think in some ways a little bit better. We have a titanium body rather than aluminum. Similar adjustments, they're a little bit smaller. Not a huge difference to me. I mean, the only difference with these is that these are smaller and more rubbery, but it's not like you're going to press them on accident. This is fully enclosed, so you don't have to worry about water getting in or running a plate of any sort. It does have that solar backup, which is nice. And going on last to the 508T Gen 2, so whether it's X2 or V2, we have, I'd say, a slight improvement on the buttons from the first generation. The buttons are a little bit bigger. They're also a little bit stiffer, so for whatever that's worth. They're not as good as RMR buttons, but you know, that's what the lawsuit was for. We also still have that solar battery backup, and the biggest difference by far is the side-loading battery. I will say this is a different battery. It's a smaller one. These ones take CR2032s, and then these ones take the new generation Holosuns with the side loader. They take 1632s, I believe. So you're gonna have shorter battery life, but having the ability to swap them out without re-zeroing makes it a lot more convenient. And then obviously the big change is the shape here. As far as my preference, I can say right now that I'm probably getting rid of the RMR. I don't have enough guns milled for optics that I need to keep this, so if anybody's looking for an RMR, this one's in really good shape, shoot me a message, let me know. 508 versus this one, real differences are just the shape and then the side loader. I kind of wish Holosun made this exact optic with the side loading battery, and I know people are going to say, oh, they make a 507, which is kind of the same thing, and yeah, it is with the side loading battery tray, but it's not titanium, which doesn't bug me that much. I do like the shape of this optic. I don't like the way it looks, but I do admit that I understand that it might be more sturdy than this round shape, and I do really like having the side loading battery. But the thing is, this doesn't conceal quite as well as this round shape does, and it has a shorter effective window height. So when you're actually shooting and you're trying to track that dot under recoil, it's going to be a little bit easier to keep that dot in your window the entire time with this slightly taller window than it would be with this. It's a really small difference. One last thing I do have to say, I have to mention, is that this optic that I have currently, I did message Holosun about this. I've yet to hear back, and I'm sure it's just delayed because they have so many messages. As it is right now, that reticle, that circle dot reticle that we've talked about, mine is rotated by a good 3 to 5 degrees. Like, as in, if you took the reticle and just rotated it like this, that's what it looks like through the window. And it's not me and my eyes being weird. I've confirmed this with other people as well. It looks that way to them. And I've heard of this issue happen on other Holosuns as well. So if there's something to be said about American manufacturing, never had that with a Trijicon, but also you don't have the option for multiple reticles anyway. I'm really hoping that Holosun will fix this or replace it. And if they do, good on them. I'll update you guys. But for right now, I do have to mention that because I feel like that's not something you should have to worry about with a new optic that costs, you know, damn near $400. All that said, I think either of these are good choices. I honestly might pick up a 507 X2 just so I can have this shape with the side loading battery. I don't know for sure if I'm going to keep this. Got to think about it. But for right now, I'm really happy with both of these, and I will probably be ditching this RMR. If you made it this far, thank you for staying. Thank you for watching. I realized while I'm editing this that this video is very long, so I'm going to cut this in half. This video is essentially going to serve as an overview / comparison / exact dimensions for these optics. Once I have a chance to do a little bit more evaluation and testing with the optic, I will finish filming and editing and producing the actual review of the 508T X2. But for now, I'm going to cut it off here. Thanks again for watching. If you guys have any ideas for future videos, like I said, let me know down below, and I will try to make that happen. All right, take care. See ya.